This is Humanities in the Western Tradition, Lecture 11, Roman Republic, Roman Values. Rome's history spans more than 2,500 years since its legendary founding in 753 BCE. Rome is one of the oldest continually occupied cities in Europe. In the ancient world, it was successively the capital of the Roman Kingdom, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire. Since the 1st century AD, Rome has been considered the seat of the papacy, and in the 8th century it became the capital of the Papal States, which lasted until 1870. In 1871, Rome became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy, and in 1946, that of the Italian Republic. It is regarded as one of the birthplaces of Western civilization. Historians talk about the fall of Rome, and we will too, but you have to understand, Rome never really fell. It simply changed. Rome is truly what the ancients called her, the eternal city, in Latin, Roma Aeterna. This idea of an eternal city and the civic pride she engendered is going to become a central notion in ancient Roman culture. But how did Rome get to be Rome? Well, there are conflicting stories. There is first and foremost archaeological evidence of human occupation of the area that Rome occupies from about 14,000 years ago. Evidence of tools, pottery, stone weapons that attest to about 10,000 years of human presence. Several of these excavations support the view that Rome grew from pastoral settlements on the Palatine Hill, built above the area of the future Roman Forum. Yet while we know there were people living here in settlements long before the 8th century date of the founding story, these stories have become so much a part of the Roman legend that the earlier people are frequently forgotten. So we begin with an area that has an indigenous pastoral population of shepherds and farmers. Archaeological evidence does indicate that somewhere between 2000 and 1000 BCE, there was an influx of population on this peninsula, and we build on this the myths of our founding of Rome, the city that will become an empire. The Roman writer Virgil, in his epic The Aeneid, tells the story of the arrival on the Italian peninsula and the founding of Rome by a Trojan prince named Aeneas, whose mother was the goddess Venus. The Aeneid was written under the Emperor Augustus, who wanted to claim his own lineage through Julius Caesar from the hero Aeneid and thus from the gods. You remember the Trojan War that Homer wrote about? According to the Aeneid, the survivors from the fallen city of Troy banded together under Aeneas. They underwent a series of adventures around the Mediterranean Sea, including a stop at newly founded city of Carthage on the North African coast, which was under the rule of Queen Dido. Dido and Aeneas have a great love affair, but the gods then tell Aeneas about rich lands across the Mediterranean, so eventually he leaves her, and according to the story, she is so devastated by this she commits suicide. The Trojans, however, safely land on the Italian coast, the southwest of Rome, probably at Laurentium, or in other versions of the story at Lavinium, a place named for Lavinia, the daughter of the king there, Latinus. Before the arrival of Aeneas, Lavinius was engaged to a guy named Turnus, but she rejects him to instead marry Aeneas. This starts a series of armed conflicts between Turnus and the people, Lavinia's people, which escalates into a war. Aeneas wins the war, kills Turnus, and by this the Trojans win the right to stay and assimilate with the local people. Lavinia and Aeneas will have a son, Iulius. He will go on to found a line of kings who fill the chronological gap between the Trojan saga and the other traditional founding of Rome story that takes place in the 8th century BCE. The myth of Aeneas, which is Greek in origin and is adopted by the Roman people, has to be reconciled with the original Italian myth of Romulus and Remus, who, if taken as historical figures, would have to have been born around 771 BCE. In this myth, Romulus and Remus are the sons of Rhea Silvia, a daughter of Numitor, an Alban king, one of those descendants of Aeneas and Lavinia, And their father is the god Mars, the god of war. Because there's a prophecy they will overthrow their great uncle, Amulus, who has already overthrown Rhea's father, Numitor, they were, in the manner of many mythological heroes, abandoned at birth. In this case, by being placed in a trough and thrown in the river Tiber. At that time, the river was flooded, and when the waters came down, the trough, still containing the two boys, came to shore. There they are found by a she-wolf, who instead of killing them, looks after them and feeds them with her own milk. The she-wolf is helped by a woodpecker who brought them food as well. Interestingly enough, both of these animals were sacred to Mars, so their father probably looked after them. Romulus and Remus are then discovered by Faustulus, a shepherd who brought the children home. He and his wife raise the boys as their own. They become shepherds, but these boys are natural leaders and gain many followers. On reaching adulthood, they hear the story of their origins and decide to kill their uncle Amulus, and they reinstate their grandfather Numitor as king of Alba Longa, but then they go off to found a town of their very own. For this new city, Romulus and Remus choose the place where the she-wolf had nursed them. Romulus begins to build walls on the Palatine Hill, but Remus wants to build the city on the Aventine Hill. Romulus's walls are short, and Remus jeers at them because they're so low. He leaps over the walls to prove this. Romulus gets angry, and the ensuing fight between the boys, Romulus kills Remus. Romulus continues building his new city, naming it Roma. The Etruscans, who lived in Etruria to the north of the Italian peninsula, were known as Tyrians by the Greeks. They were at their height in Italy from the 8th to the 5th century BCE. Although some historians consider them indigenous to the Italic peninsula, Herodotus, a Greek historian, in 450 BCE, reported that the Etruscans had come from Asia Minor to settle in Etruria. The Etruscans lived in what is today modern Tuscany, in the area bounded by the Tiber and the Arno rivers. The Etruscan economy is based on agriculture and trade, especially with Greeks and Carthage, and on mineral resources. In the late 7th century BCE, Rome, still a fairly small city-state, was subjugated by the Etruscans, who were a much more sophisticated and urban people. The Etruscans excelled at commerce. They conducted brisk maritime trade with advanced cultures around the eastern Mediterranean. Under Etruscan domination, Rome prospered and became a hub of commerce and transportation. And under Etruscan tutelage, the Romans began to put their spoken language into writing using the Etruscan alphabet. Even what we call Roman numerals were invented by the Etruscans. But despite the obvious advantages that contact with a higher culture had given them, the Romans rankled under the Etruscan rule, and in 509 BCE they expelled Tarquin the Proud, the last Etruscan king, and convert Rome to an independent republic. The Etruscan experience made the Romans intense foes of kings and monarchies, a dislike that is going to play a large part in Roman history. The story that goes with that last rebellion against the Etruscans is a story of a woman named Lucretia. According to the legend, in the time of the Etruscan king Tarquinius Superbus, the Romans were laying siege to Ardea in the territory of the Rutulians. One day, some of the young leaders of the Roman army were boasting about the virtues of their wives, each claiming to have the best wife. They decide to ride their horses secretly to observe their wives. In Rome, they saw that the daughters-in-law of the king were enjoying a lavish dinner party. In Calatia, however, Lucretia, the wife of Collatinus Tarquinius, was up in the middle of the night with her servants working on wool. Collatinus and the others were welcomed into the house. Among them was Sextus Tarquinius, the son of the king. A few days later, Sextus Tarquinius secretly returned to that house, where he was given dinner and lodging by Lucretia, although her husband was not home. Late at night, he entered her room and attempted to rape her. She resisted until he threatened to kill both her and her slave, and he told her that if if she didn't succumb to him, he would kill her and the slave and make it seem as if she had been killed while caught in an act of adultery with the slave. Rather than leave this legacy of dishonor for her husband, she gave in to him and allowed him to rape her. As soon as he left, she sent urgent messages to her father and to her husband, telling them to come in haste, as a terrible thing had happened. Her father came with several Roman leaders, one of them Lucilius Junius Brutus. Lucretia tearfully tells them what happened and asks each of the men to seek revenge. The men try to console her, calling her blameless, as force had been used. She, however, prefers death to even a hint of dishonor, and pulling a dagger from her clothes, takes her own life. In the first moment of grief and shock, Brutus pulls out the bloody dagger and swears to avenge Lucretia and all others who have been wronged by the king, stopping at nothing short of the expulsion of the king and all the Etruscans from Rome. Collatinus, Lucretius, and Valerius join in this oath, and they carry the body of Lucretia to the Forum. There, the words and passion of these men, together with the bloody body of Lucretia, who has taken her own life because she's been dishonored, inflame a band of Romans to march to Rome, where Calatia is garrisoned, and the armed band left for Rome led by Brutus. In Rome, some of the leading men join the band, and there Brutus again speaks about the terrible crime and the other outrages suffered by the people from the king. The people decide to expel the Etruscans and banish the king's family. A band led by Brutus is sent to the army in Ardea to take control in place of the king. Lucretius, who's already been appointed prefect, is left in command in Rome. When the news reaches the king in Ardea, he leaves for Rome, but the gates are closed against him. He goes into exile in Etruria with some of his family. Sextus Tarquinius is killed by some of his old enemies, and in this way the reign of kings and the Etruscan rule is brought to an end in Rome. Rome is, in this early republic, divided between two classes, the landed, aristocratic patricians and unorganized, disenfranchised plebeians. It is the patricians who set up the new government. They set up, first and foremost, a Senate, the real center of power. This is a successor to the old Council of Landlords that existed under the kings. Senators serve for life. They're usually elected late in their careers after having moved through the ranks of magistrates. Eventually, senatorial judgments will achieve the force of law, and in the end, the glory and the future of Roman Republic depends on able and patriotic senators. The consuls, two men appointed from the senators, each having veto power over the other, hold executive power in this government. They give legal, fiscal, and other power to magistrates, to public offices, and legislative and judicial powers to an assembly. All of these reforms to government are being watched jealously by the plebeians, who have no part in them. The ultimate source of sovereignty in the Roman Republic, as in modern republic, is with the demos, or the people. The people of Rome gathered into legislative assemblies to pass laws and elect executive magistrates. Election to a magisterial office resulted in automatic membership in the Senate for life unless impeached. And while the Senate managed the day-to-day affairs in Rome and senators presided over courts, executive magistrates enforced the law and presided over the legislative assemblies. This is a complex set of checks and balances developed between these branches of government, the Senate, the consuls, and the assembly, to minimize the risk of tyranny and corruption and maximize good government. However, the separation of powers between those branches was not absolute, and moreover, there were several constitutional problems. Devices that were out of harmony with Roman constitution were used frequently. Part of the problem stems from this divide between the rich and the poor. The patricians are the rich, landed, aristocratic class. They own the land that is farmed sometimes by farmers outside the city. They bought up farms when they went bankrupt and owned more and more land. And farmers who were disenfranchised or lost their farms would come into the city and live lives of poverty. The plebeians are this class, this working class and lower class, who generally are struggling for most of the time. They have little say initially in government. Eventually, they are allowed to participate in the assembly. There's a plebeian assembly as well as a patrician assembly. The Senate, however, is initially still reserved for aristocrats. Eventually, the plebeians are going to go on strike. Literally, now Rome is at this time engaged in conquest and is beginning to build empire. And a lot of the civic duty that Romans feel is to support their city. Like the Greeks, the ordinary people went to war. So farmers who go to war sometimes go to war because they can gain land. A tribune or a centurion, a military leader who comes back from war, can be given a piece of land, either in the conquered area or sometimes outside of Rome, to farm and have a way of supporting himself after his military service is ended. But at the same time, these plebeians who go off to war frequently come back to find their farms are gone, have been assumed by those in authority, those patricians. At one point in the 5th century, around 449, the patricians and the plebeians come to a distinct conflict. Plebeians want to go on strike. They say, if we all leave the city, if we all take our goods that we make, these are the people who are selling in the marketplace, these are the people who are working as servants, these are the people who are doing the day-to-day business of the city. If they pick up and leave the city will cease to function. And this is a viable threat. At the same time, plebeian soldiers say, we're not going to war anymore. We are not going to go fight unless we get more rights in government. And so the patricians give in and form plebeian representation in government. One of these forms of representation is the tribune. Tribunes, originally this is a military title, but civil tribunes become the representatives of the plebeians in government, in the Senate. Now, they're not allowed to actually contribute to Senate discussions, but they do have the right of veto. They can say, no, we forbid it. If this law that the Senate is passing does not serve the best interests of all the people, rich and poor, the tribunes who are appointed by the plebeians can veto the law that the Senate is trying to put in place. And this is one thing that the patricians do to placate the lower classes. As in Greece, we're going to see this also leads to some problems, some corruption, because those with money can, again, once those that are poorer have the right to vote, those with money can again buy votes from those poorer people. So patricians frequently pay plebeians to vote in their blocks, that the way they. In 449 BCE, the Senate puts forth this idea of 12 tables as a centerpiece of Roman constitution. The 12 tables is part of this long social struggle between patricians and plebeians, because initially only patricians can become magistrates, and this, among other plebeian complaints, is a source of discontent. In the context of the unequal status, plebeians would take action to secure concessions for themselves, using that threat of secession. One of the most important concessions won in this class struggle is this set of 12 tables establishing basic procedural rights for all Roman citizens against each other. Like most early codes of law, they're largely procedural, combining strict and rigorous penalties with equally strict and rigorous procedural forms. These laws will set up a model for plebeians to have rights guaranteed by the Constitution. The legend about the production of these laws, as the Roman historian Livy tells it, 10 Roman citizens were chosen to record the laws. Decem viri legibus scripundus. 10 laws written down by scribes. While they were performing this task, they were given supreme political power, whereas the power of the magistrates was restricted. In 450 BCE, these decemviri produced the basic laws on 10 tablets. But these laws initially were unsatisfactory to the plebeians, and a second set of decemviri is said to have added 2 further tablets in 449. This new law of 12 tablets was approved by the entirety of the People's Assembly. The fragments which survive show that it was not a law code in the modern sense. It didn't provide a complete and coherent system of all applicable rules or give legal solutions for all possible cases. Rather, the tables contain provisions designed to change the then existing customary law. Although the provisions pertain to all areas of law, the largest part is dedicated to private law and private procedure. Roman law is developed and codified slowly over time. It begins originally as oral traditions in the Senate, in the Assembly, and as Rome conquers, these laws are going to be applied in all territories of the empire. For the most part, as Rome conquered various regions, Gaul and in the Germanic states and Greece, they allowed individual territories to govern themselves under Roman jurisdiction. Sometimes those laws are added into, and as you're reading this week, you're reading some of those various laws from the territories as well as under certain emperors. But those Roman laws come down and eventually become part of codified Roman law. Under Justinian, an emperor who reigned 527 to 565 CE, they're going to be compiled. And those laws of Justinian are going to become the basis for canon law, church law, and for much of Western law today. So what are Roman values? Above all, the Romans were a practical people, interested chiefly in what was useful. They had a strong moral sense. They were inclined to view intellectual brilliance with suspicion. Roman authority figures, such as political leaders and fathers, cultivated the virtue known as gravitas, or seriousness, a duty to state and a duty to family. The Romans made up for the absence of intellectual fire by their ingenious adaptation and borrowing from other cultures. In Rome, as elsewhere in the ancient world, religion permeated the life of the family. Family duty was considered critical. Roman morality and Roman law both echo a rural ethic by stressing the need to submit to the order of nature and live within one's means. Rome's agrarian tradition also contributed the ideal of the patriotic farmer-soldier. Early leaders of the Republican period who never strayed far from their farming heritage became national idols, held up to schoolboys as models. Another important Roman value was the sanctity of the family. Divorce was unheard of until the late Republican era, and even then family values continued to be eulogized by moralists and honored by political leaders. Within the Roman family, the roles of father and mother were strictly defined. defined, the family was guided by the father, the paterfamilias, who exercised legal power of life and death over the entire household, including his spouse, children, and other relatives, as well as servants and slaves. The father wielded greater authority, the paterfamilias wielded greater authority than his Greek counterpart, but in contrast, the Roman matron or Roman wife was freer and had more practical influence than the secluded wives of Greece. In general, Roman matrons were conspicuously present in society, attending and presiding at gatherings, along with their mates, and supervising the education of both male and female offspring. As in Greece, military campaigns were important, but Roman military is associated with political power and brought political power. Roman generals conquered throughout far-flung territories across Europe and well into Britain, and were brought back in Rome in triumph, with parades and great celebrations. It was success in military campaigns were the basis for your political career. Even though the Romans were not as creative as Greeks and did not value intellectual achievement the way the Greeks did, they did know a good idea when they saw it, and they adapted it. They took from Greek and from other world cultures and incorporated it into the Roman world. Overall, the Romans were a very practical people. They saw architecture, for instance, as more value than sculpture. But when they did use sculpture, they used it in ways to reflect their history and their ancestry. They respected their ancestors. And we'll see that as we proceed to a later lecture on Roman art. Next time, we'll talk a little bit more about the Roman expansion and conquests and building of empire, and how Rome shifts from a republic to an empire ruled by an emperor.